I'm Tadj Oreszczyn. I'm the director of the Bartlett School of Environment, Energy and Resources, and it's my great pleasure to chair this panel session focusing on the future of building performance. And we're really privileged to have such great panel members both from industry and academia. So the way the panel session will work is that in a few minutes I will ask each panelist to briefly introduce themselves and say a little bit about where they see the future of building performance going. And then we will open up the discussion to the floor for you to have an opportunity to grill the panel members. So if we could start off from this end.
Right. Thank you very much, Tadj. My name's John Palmer from AECOM, and first thing I'd like to say is it's lovely to see so much enthusiasm for building performance. It really reminds me of the 1970s when we had it then. I wonder what's happened. But seriously, it's good. We had a good time back in the 1970s, and I started off working on it. We were monitoring a school, a low-energy school, and we had about 1,200 sensors on this school. We knew when the toilets were flushed and how much water was used in washing hands afterwards. You people who love data would have loved it. It was marvellous. We had data coming out of our ears, but we really didn't know what to do with it. But we finally, after a couple of years of analysis, we worked out how inefficient the boilers were and how inefficient the domestic hot water was, and the lighting wasn't very good. That if you're going to put in run-around coils or heat pipe, heat recovery systems, you really need to just monitor them a year just to commission them. And that's a year of hour-by-hour monitoring, and they never really worked after that anyway. I also did a fair share of humping around a big fan and pressure testing about 100 houses in Birmingham, which formed a lot of the database for the air leakage properties of all buildings. And you'll have seen that curve, I've no doubt, the one that's used to underpin building regulations about how leaky houses were, and the 10 air changes now and all that sort of business. So I did that, and a fair amount of infrared thermography and all this sort of caper. But one of the key things that happened was in the mid-80s, we got together with a erstwhile colleague and a person whose name was venerated in this place, Pat O'Sullivan. And we worked with Pat O'Sullivan and his team down at Cardiff, and we were working as part of a Department of Energy scheme to accelerate the uptake of passive solar design, which I'm glad I heard about this afternoon. It's not died a death. I thought it had. It may well make a comeback, but we were very lucky in this because the sensible people at the Department of Energy at the time said, work out how you're going to do it and tell us how you're going to do it, and then come back and do it on a variety of domestic buildings and non-domestic buildings. So we spent about 2 years working out how we were going to do it to give a robust answer. And this is to get to the heart of building performance evaluation. And we thought the only way we could do it was to do all the measurements we were required. So you've got to go in and do a lot of measurement. We've got to then put that in a context of a reference, where key performance indicators against the database of buildings like this and how they are performing. We've got to address the certain aspects, the design intentions of the designers, and that was key to it. What did the designer intend to do in this building? They didn't just throw kit at it, meaningless, for us to go and put lots of sensors on to measure everything and see if some numbers fell out of it at the bottom of this pile. No, what was it they intended? Did they intend that stack ventilation to be driven by passive solar means? Did they intend for the daylighting to be improved? Did, all these things in both domestic and non-domestic buildings. So we said, what is the design intention? Part of the preliminaries of that, we'd go to the designer and ask them. And that was it. And once they got that, we would then formulate a monitoring plan. And we would be data light and analysis rich. Not getting everything, not measuring everything, every data point. I mean, these are the old days. Getting a data point cost money. Keeping it and analysing it, dragging it through that all analysis, and then not using it was just a waste of money and resources. Get the minimum data that you need to, but to absolutely nail all of the questions you might get in the future about it. Anybody who's going to tackle it, say, oh, we can answer that because we measured this. If you didn't need to measure it, don't do it. We then put the cost aspect of that together as well, so all of the buildings were costed out, and that was a sort of a modelling exercise to see if it was cost effective. And we had 2 psychologists on board, myself and another colleague from Cardiff, did all the amenity stuff. Okay, so do these buildings provide what they're meant to in terms of the occupants. Do they overheat? Have they got control of their ventilation? Have they control of daylighting? Is there too much glare? Everything that what the building use survey was basically based on, I think. I have to say that. So we addressed it in every possible way, and we did this in 16 non-domestic buildings, 16 houses. We reported it even at the preliminary stage when we were deciding how we should do it. We came up with a format for a final report, an 8-page report, which pulled together all of this information in a concise and elegant way that we could take out to the industry. And we failed to do that. Because Rod Bunn came along with probe and cut the ground straight from under our feet. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Stacey.
Hi, yes, Stacey Temprell, residential sector for Saint-Gobain UK and Ireland. From a solutions manufacturing perspective, the future of building performance really for us sort of focuses on 2 key streams of activity, really. One in terms of solution development, in terms of individual products, addressing some of the issues highlighted by Rob Panel earlier in terms of the Zero Carbon Hub report, in terms of from simple identification of materials to more sophisticated, holistic sort of building design of elements in terms of walls, floors and roofs that are actually going to work better together, but can be tested in a much more robust way rather than in a lab setting, which we know bears very little resemblance on any day to what actually happens in reality. And the second key stream for building performance, the future of that for us as an organisation, is not only looking at the sort of product solutions, but also looking at the solutions in terms of testing. Obviously, the sector can benefit greatly if we've got much more robust testing measurement practices than what we've actually got at the moment to actually be able to do an end-of-line crash test for a building. Shouldn't be beyond the wit of man, as it is for cars and pretty any other product that you can buy out there. Thank you.
Peter.
Hi, I'm Peter Raynham. I work here at the Institute of IEDE, and I'm course director for the Light and Lighting MSc programme. I've been in the lighting industry too long. I think it's 40 years this year, and 20 of which have been at UCL. So my background has been purely light and lighting, and watching as the technology has slowly improved. But the thing that hasn't changed and where the future problems are is what we actually do with the light we get. We're in a situation where we're probably using far too much energy for lighting, and yet we don't really know what we're doing with it, why we have it here, what is it that we want lit. Nobody will really answer you a sensible question in that way. So the future is interesting, but where we're quite going, I wouldn't like to say, but watch this space, we'll try and research it.
Judit.
Hi, my name is Judit Kimpian. I'm Director for Sustainable Architecture and Research at AHR Architects. And I think what's the future of building? Well, I think it can only get better. and one of the important points for us has been to recognize that the importance of feedback. If you think about any other strands of product design or engineering, it's almost unthinkable to ignore the lessons learned from the product's performance in use. And some people say that we're going through a Volkswagen moment in construction, but actually that means that we would have to be breaking some laws. And I think the issue here is often we can have very poorly performing buildings without breaking any laws whatsoever. So we know very well that the current legislative framework is not conducive of better performing buildings, and I think that will be a really big challenge to overcome. And I think one of the directions that we are very energetically pushing towards is for more harmonized and transparent benchmarking of buildings from design all the way to operation across the EU, and there is some progress on that front. And of course the role of data in that is extremely important. The other aspect of feedback is, as an architectural practice, we are learning every time we look at a building in operation, we understand more about the importance of the architectural determinants of building performance. And maybe Raslan may have touched on that, because he's done some wonderful work in this area. But it is extremely important for us to understand what the impact or what the benefits of architectural solutions can be for occupants' perception of comfort, productivity, health, in the context of measurable data about all of this. So I think there's a lot to be learned in that sphere for the next probably decade or so. Over to you.
Thank you. Matt.
Hello, Matt Colmer. I'm being quite contrary today because I'm now very pleased to be with the Zero Carbon Hub. So I'm on the panel representing as Associate Director for the Zero Carbon Hub. From my view of the future of building performance, it's actually the opportunities. As Rod said earlier on, we're not really learning anything new from what we've learned previously. So now we have to act on what we do know. And I think there are huge amounts of opportunities there. Principally, what we firstly have to do is start embedding the learning. We are very, very bad at perpetuating information through the various supply chains and the various ways that we construct buildings. If we can keep embedding that information, then we'll be quite a significant way there. But then the improvement opportunities and the solutions and the bright brains that we have in the UK and the bright brains that we have in academia, we can build stuff. It's like the bionic man, isn't it? It's like we have their technology, we can do it. And there are opportunities there, and I think that with applied minds, we can actually get there very well indeed.
My name is Rokia Raslan. I'm a lecturer in building performance simulation here at UCL. In my view, and kind of carrying on from Matt's earlier presentation, I think a lot of the answers lie in some robust fundamental science. But to do that, in my view, I think the future of building performance requires that we build the proper and functional digital infrastructure needed to connect, track, understand our buildings, and to help us analyze, visualize, and improve performance through its life cycle. And to do that, we also need to have the professionals who have the skills to interact with that digital infrastructure. So I think we have a lot of data, we know a lot of stuff, but are we really connecting it properly and learning from it? Thank you.
Thank you, Rokia. So the floor is open for questions to the panelists. Does anybody have the first question about the future of building performance? There's a question here.
Five years ago, I moved into a new office and I tried to gather some data to tell me about the performance of my new office. And after about a year, I gave up because we had about 15 different meters coming into the building. It's only sort of 2,000 square meter building, 3 floors, and it would have taken a team of UCL people to unravel it. Now, 2 weeks ago, I bought a Foobot indoor air quality monitor available from all good outlets at about £100. And it gives me constant data onto my phone, everything from temperature, humidity, CO2, VOCs, particulates, everything. And over the last 2 weeks, everybody in the office has been engaging with this piece of data. So my question really is, how will this new technology, simple monitoring that everybody seems to be getting into, Stacey mentioned the weight watches, it's a very simple box that looks great. How will that affect the way that buildings? What are you individually as an organisation doing to tap into that?
So, have we finally got smart systems, and what we're going to do with them if we have?
First of all, I think it's completely going to transform the building performance discussion. We forget that we're investing resources, energy, materials, etc., into buildings to create an environment which is measurably healthy and comfortable and safe, but also perceived by the occupants to be healthy and safe and productive. And we have completely been missing this final piece in the feedback loop. And I think that's now this new technology is making that possible. And we have been focusing on energy consumption really energetically because it was the one thing that was, even though it was really difficult to measure, it was possible to measure as opposed to the perception and the actual data about comfort. And so I think it's going to be a massive change. I still think that measuring energy is absolutely critical in buildings because it is, it's what it takes to create those to create those spaces. But actually being able to do the two together will complete that feedback loop that we're so emphasizing.
Yeah, John.
Yeah, I think it's a great thing, democratizing the knowledge, as it were, but it's a bit of a nightmare for what's going to happen when you've got, as we saw a graph earlier on, showing you can never please all of the people all the time. So it could be the squeakiest wheel gets the lubrication. But it would have been very useful in the case we were monitoring two buildings for BRE many years ago to look at the difference between naturally ventilated and mechanically ventilated buildings. And such a device would have been really useful for them in the mechanically ventilated building because what we found is that at 6 o'clock in the morning, when the boiler started up, the building got filled up with combustion products of nitrous oxide, carbon monoxide, and carbon dioxide from the boiler flue. So I think there is some advantages in it, but I do think it might be a bit of a nightmare as well in how you respond to it, to deal with everybody's individual take on it.
We do see a huge amount of smart technology out there at the moment, and I think the challenge is using it appropriately and collecting the correct amount of data. There is a very fine line between taking control and allowing people to have control. And I think what we'll find is there's going to be a plethora of devices which are giving people control, which will then, we know from experiences of BPE, it's like buildings can work fine until you put people in there. And so but people want control, and so what we need to get that fine line is the smart technologies optimizing while still allowing people to use their buildings as they see fit. And this is where it gets a very complicated line where you then start having a huge amount of data that's coming in and what you actually do with it. So it's very much ensuring that we don't get app fatigue, we don't get smart data fatigue, we understand what we're collecting and we're using it appropriately.
Anybody else like to?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
I think it's game-changing, absolutely game-changing. And I think there's the distinction there between sort of technology to control features of the home and technology to actually allow people to measure what their home's actually doing. And I think the latter is the bit that really is game-changing, particularly in the UK where we have such a speculative build market in residential. I think it is nothing short of game-changing.
Another question.
Chris Twin. I too am fascinated by the ability of distributed cheap sensors and play around with them, and that's how one learns. I offer an observation, it's at one level a word of warning. For example, the cheap sensors don't measure radiant temperature. And in an office, for example, that is very significant. If you're close to a window, you've got cold radiation, and the AC doesn't see it at all. So there's elements that these sensors don't actually pick up. And likewise at home, I put in an optimum start plus or minus 0.2 of a degree C sensor controller about 15 years ago. My wife still puts up the temperature because her metabolic rate changes depending on whether she's walking around in the morning or sitting down watching television in the evening or what have you. So, and thirdly, coming back to the fact that the radiant temperature changes between summer and winter. Therefore, the comfort temperature required of the system then changes. Now, so what one's saying is there is a level of, yes, we're getting to a first step, but we mustn't see that as the holy grail. And this is in two counts. One, for the reasons I've explained. But two, we are amateurs when it comes to offering end consumers sophisticated systems. If you look at an iPhone, who reads a manual? Who gets educated? And we keep talking about educating our end users. Same with a car. What they do is very subtly different in design. You have failure modes. You do something wrong, it doesn't work. You have another go, and the system doesn't blow up in your face. We are not used to that robustness of the systems to allow people to tinker, for it then to not work and them to get feedback and say, well, the heating isn't actually sized that large to have a full opening window all the time. I suggest you go back and close the window, for example. I think we need almost a quantum leap in thinking of controls, understanding, controls logic, the 1.5 second feedback time, things like this, and even the issue of games technology, where you're looking at complexity versus the benefits you get back from it. There's a whole set of science there we haven't even started to look at. So in a sense, I'm interested in the panel's view of how far have we still got to go? And at a level of, this seems to be very ripe for additional research, and therefore the establishment we're in, ideal. It seems to be very ripe for needing an awful lot more research before we get to the point where we can understand the human being.
So I think the question is are we ready for the quantum leap? I guess, are we ready for the quantum leap to be as good as car manufacturers in the construction industry?
I think the simple answer to the question is, at present, no. In the building controls industry, we haven't had the concentration of effort at focus. So classically, if we think back to the computer industry in the late 70s, early 80s, they all got a massive project at Xerox Palo Alto, and out of that through pretty much everything we know about the current interface to computer systems. We just haven't had that. To give you the simplest of examples, have you been to a hotel room with a lighting control system in? Have you ever come across 2 hotel rooms in different hotels which had the same symbols on the control? That is where we're at the moment. We don't even know how to understand. Most controls as yet are not self-configuring. They don't optimize. There is no positive feedback to the user, and there's more significant resistance to the user by the users, particularly as the Internet of Things is coming along, because all of a sudden we have this control system, but you do not own your own data to know how your control system is working. So all of a sudden, if you have one major brand of control system, which may or may not be owned by a search engine, is it likely that you're going to get a lot of spam emails from various energy providers saying, we know what you're using, why don't you try us for us as a supplier? So there's so many levels of uncertainty in the market, we don't quite know what we're controlling for. There certainly is scope for a major 3 to 5 year project with all of the industry stakeholders signing up. Now, whether that will happen or not because of commercial pressures, I don't know, but it's something that needs doing in the industry.
I think that we're not ready for a quantum leap. We do need more research. I think the question is how far we need to drive down the performance of our buildings. We mentioned earlier on that bringing down air tightness is all well and good, but the further down you go, the more difficult it becomes. And without sounding too contrite, it reminds me of a quote from The Big Bang Theory, actually, which is probably more appropriate for the American audiences. But it was, the last 2% is the hardest part. Why do you think the milk people leave it in? And so it's like, that's the problem, is the fact that we don't really know where we have to hit. So it's a moving target at the moment.
I think I'm a little bit more optimistic. We have lots of young members of the family in their early 20s, and they can do things on computers I wouldn't even be able to dream of in terms of coding. And I think I just advise them to go into product design and combination of product design and engineering, because I think the opportunities are enormous. And yes, the partnership with research is essential, but in terms of product design, the opportunities are gigantic. So I can see them making, we've seen what happened with Nest, and that was just the first. There are so many more coming.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions there, and then a question along.
Just a couple of things. One observation and one question. The observation is that we must get clear in our heads that most people in internal environments don't want to control the environment. What they do want to do is alleviate discomfort. And teachers, for example, are given far too many opportunities to control, which they don't want, but they do want ease of which they can alleviate discomfort. That's just an observation. I do have a question, though, and that is building performance data. We're all talking about we want more data, we want to do more research. A lot of this stuff is commercially toxic and professionally toxic. And it doesn't go down awfully well when you do some POE on a building and you have to report back that it didn't do what you thought it was going to do. So my question to the panel is, how can we remove the commercial toxicity from building performance evaluation data?
Okay, perhaps we'll take the three questions and then we'll ask the panel to time to think about that one.
Should I just throw the question back to Tamsin?
Yep.
We're doing really well, actually.
I'd simply like to know what the future is for building performance for the 97 or 98% of the stock that isn't going to be built this year. In other words, how are we going to deal with the great bulk of buildings that haven't received a large amount of investment in the last year or so?
I'm going off on a completely different tangent. I think that the way we procure buildings is central to this issue, and I would like to suggest that the cost of a building that really works is somewhat higher than the cost of the buildings that we're delivering at the moment, and that by procuring buildings on lowest cost, we are ending up with buildings that don't work because we don't have the resources to put into making them work properly. What does the panel think about that?
Okay, so we've got three questions. How do we deal with professional toxicity? How do we deal with the existing built stock? And do good buildings cost more? Three, I think, very easy questions for the panelists then. Who would like to start?
Shall I have a go at some of them? One thing that would be nice for POE type data is if we could deal with it in the same way we deal with health epidemiology. Yep, we can have blind data coming up. We can see a list, in epidemiology we can see a list of who's died and why. If the names are cut off, then the guilty are somewhat protected, or as you might say. The next question was, sorry, your question was the
existing building stock.
Existing building stock. Yes, it's a horrible problem. A long time ago, I was president of a society of light and lighting, and during my year that I was president, we ran what was called a masterclass series called One Building a Minute, which we worked out that if we by 2050 are going to get to the energy performance we need to treat one building a minute. Now, my guess is it's 3 years on, so it's about one building every 55 seconds. And there doesn't seem to be, no matter how much we hope, there doesn't seem to be the urge and the emphasis on going refurbishment. There should be, but it isn't happening, unfortunately. And finally, does it cost more to get good buildings? And the answer is essentially it shouldn't do. Looking at the building process, I think half the problem very often is the naive nature of the client. because the client doesn't know quite what they want. Where you have a company that's doing serial buildings, very often they're able to take out cost and get what they want. So there are ways, but yes, it's quite often that we end up being prepared to pay more for a good building. It doesn't have to be that way, but it may well be.
I'll just deal with the toxicity of the data bit, I think. And I actually don't think it's that bad. We've had some pretty big names in the program, and okay, it's, you know, Innovate UK and it's funded and all that kind of stuff. This is the BP program. But, you know, we've had some fairly large organizations doing full disclosure on the challenges they've had with their buildings. And I think that there is a middle ground there in terms of once some people start doing it and the world doesn't cease and all that kind of stuff, then more people will be encouraged to do it. But then we do have, as I say, you know, beating the drum for the digital catapult, we also have now the facilities to be able to convene information in a neutral basis and not necessarily disclose names, but still disclose challenges. So I think we have to work with these organizations rather than stand aback and point at them and saying that this is not good. If we treat it as an open platform of sharing, then there's no reason why people won't engage with that.
How many litigations did you have in the BP program?
Oh,
in
you did.
Relating to building platforms?
You've asked me that one before, and you know I hate that question. We've.
But the answer is really good.
The answer is very good. We've only actually had a couple out of the portfolio of initially 115 projects that went into the program and 105 that successfully completed. The 10 of those were complete just challenges with the buildings themselves in completion. But we've only actually had 2 scenarios where there have been legal challenges within the portfolio, which is not too bad.
And
actually.
relating to the performance of the building or relating to other things?
Relating to challenges that got, really difficult to say here, relating to challenges that were revealed as part of the BPE process.
Thank you.
John.
Don't do that again.
If I'm just trying to address the last one about the cost of buildings that work and are they more expensive. And are there any quantity surveyors in here? Is there anybody here who's had experience of quantity surveyors coming along and cutting out things which should work? Why aren't we talking to them? Why are we not talking to the people that come along afterwards and take out all of your sustainable stuff, and you end up with an expression my colleague Mark Bourne comes up with, it's homeopathic sustainability. You've taken out so much of it that all you have is a sort of a distant memory that it was actually a sustainable building. So, you know, can we not think about talking and educating some of the people that make really significant decisions on reducing costs, but consequently reducing the performance of our buildings?
I'd like to comment on the easiest of these questions, I think, which is what do we do with the 1% of the stock that isn't kind of subject to any major investment this year, and how do we improve the performance of that remaining stock? Well, I've worked on several retrofit projects in the last few years, trying to find different answers and solutions, whether at mass scale or tailored scale. And I think one thing that a lot of projects that try to do that miss is the opportunity of trying to sell the co-benefits of that. It might not be easy to sell the benefits of reducing your energy consumption to a lot of people, but selling things like improvements in health and well-being that Mark Cella discussed earlier might work for a large section of the population, among other things.
Can I add?
Yeah.
So I think we've been, in the last 15 or so years, we've been really missing the game in terms of improving the performance of the existing stock, because we were focusing on energy performance. Actually, we have completely decoupled the functional retrofits of the building and the financial incentives for the functional retrofits of the buildings from the energy retrofits of the buildings. And I think that's a mistake on every level. If we were to rethink the way in which we incentivize the retrofitting, the functional and architectural retrofitting of the existing stock, and basically gave actual operational performance KPIs to projects to release the financial incentives, we would be in a very, very different situation in even as soon as in 2 to 5 years' time, I think. I've got lots of proofs for that, obviously. And just going then to Tamsin's question, can I throw the question back at you? Because you would be able to answer that much better than I would.
Well, what we've been thinking about recently is how we can set up a tender process where the contractors are rewarded for including elements that will help to improve the building performance. Because I think part of the problem is where as was mentioned with heat pump manufacturers overstating what the performance of their equipment will be because they know that's what everyone else is going to do. I think the same thing happens when you're tendering a project. You know that everyone else is going to leave out certain things because they think they can get away with it, and or rather that a more positive incentive, it's more that they know they won't win the job unless they pitch it lower than their competitors. And therefore, clients need to learn to be much clearer about what they're asking for that will allow the team that they're procuring to deliver the performance they want. And that is difficult with less experienced clients. So we need to support them by making sure that there is a really clear set of requirements that allows that team to deliver the required performance. And currently, that is not within the tender process, or it's not explicit enough to allow that to be priced on a level playing field so that can be delivered.
Thank you. I'm going to take Chairman's privilege to ask the last question. Clearly, we've seen that our knowledge has evolved quite considerably over the last 20 years, although some of our colleagues would say that we're still talking about similar sorts of things as we have been over the last few decades. The technologies we're dealing with are roughly the same that we've been talking about for the last 30 years. We've clearly got a lot more examples of good practice and the fact that we can do it if we get everything well aligned. But the time we've got to finally deliver, particularly on carbon targets, is actually quite short. So what's the one radical thing that we need to do to shift our building performance over the next decade? What would be the one thing that you would recommend? Who wants to start?
Outputs-based assessment, basically. So rather than building things on what they should be on paper, it's making sure that people build stuff that does do what it's supposed to do, and if they don't, then they get penalised.
I'll give an answer that's not at all based on what I do, but I think we should fund more research in this area and put together, and just my own opinion, and more importantly, fund initiatives to take research from sort of the academic world to something that's implementable out there in a shorter period of time.
Judit?
Something that's totally not at all challenging, which is get the regulations to focus on operational performance, i.e. you've never heard this from me, disclosure, disclosure, disclosure.
Peter?
Well, working in a university, I'm going to say more research funding, please. Yes. But I think the point is that we've got to go to those performance-based metrics and performance in use rather than performance in design. And we've got to understand the differences between the two and why and what change our evaluation methods for performance in design so they actually meet performance in use.
Stacey?
I agree wholeheartedly with Matt's recommendation, but in addition to that, I think we just need absolute certainty in terms of the legislation framework rather than things chopping and changing in terms of policy and focus. Everybody has, agreed to lots of initiatives, most notably fees, from the exemplary work that's been done by the Zero Carbon Hub. So, you had industry in the main uniting behind something there that was really going to push things on, and the government not supporting it.
Thank you. John?
It's difficult to top all of those laudable aims, but just building on what I've heard a lot of this afternoon and what Rod was saying particularly about what's changed since what have we learned. Can't we communicate some of this stuff outside ourselves, our own disciplines, and get it out into the professions that really deliver these buildings so they don't keep making the same mistakes? And we really need to disseminate the findings of this sort of work and research much wider to the people that are going to make it. Whether they try and do it to regulations or not, I don't know. I've worked on building regulations, we know they get ignored, but if people don't know what to do from consequence of what we've learned from research, then it goes nowhere.
Thank you. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for engaging so well with the questions.
Interesting. Yeah. Is it Monday?
Right, so.
Oh. You can tell I'm retired.
Thank you very much to the panel and to Tadj for that very interesting debate. I'm just going to briefly close now by saying a few thanks. I found that an incredibly stimulating and interesting day. There was a huge amount in it. I'd like to thank all of today's speakers. I'd like to thank all of you for coming along today. It was just fantastic to see so many people here, so thank you very much for that. I'd like to thank Rachel, Diane, and all of the UCL team. Alice, Ben, and Olivia from the Zero Carbon Hub and the Zero Carbon Hub and Innovate UK teams for putting the event series together. So I'd like to thank Saint-Gobain again for their sponsorship. I would encourage you to, let's continue the conversation. We have these series of IEDE, IEDE Learn lecture series, so please do come along and participate in those. Please do continue the conversation via our LinkedIn group. Details of that are on our website, so please do have a look for that. Perhaps most importantly, here is the map to the drinks and jazz and canopies. I don't know how familiar you are with the UCL campus, but I'm probably going to struggle to get there from here. But there are several ushers who will happily guide you. Basically, you go out of the Darwin building through the into the south quadrangle, turn left under the arch. If any of that sounds familiar, then that's great. If it doesn't, then follow one of the ushers. Basically, what you're looking for is the UCL South Cloisters. If you ask anyone who looks like a student or an academic, they'll probably point you in the right direction. So please do join us across there. It's only about, if you go in the right direction, it's a 4 or 5 minute walk. It starts in about 10 or 15 minutes. Please do join us there. Alan Penn, the Dean of the Faculty, will be there to say a few words shortly. So thank you very much again to all the speakers and to all of you for coming along. Fantastic event. Thanks again.